Hello everyone, welcome to another Star Wars Visual Showcase review. It's been a while since we've had one of these, mainly because the EU review as a podcast is over. We started a new podcast called Star Wars Beyond the Films, which you can find at starwarsreport.com or over on Facebook at facebook.com/swbeyondfilms or on Twitter, same way, swbeyondfilms. Now, all of these Visual Showcase episodes are going to be showing up on the Facebook page for Star Wars Beyond the Films and on the EU Cantina YouTube channel. So that's eucantina.net or youtube.com/EU, or the EU Cantina. What you see in front of me here are what we're going to take a look at this time. Specifically, this behemoth right here. This all goes back to the idea of the Star Wars newspaper strips. Back in 1979, the Los Angeles Times newspaper syndicate got the rights to produce Star Wars comic strips, newspaper strips. They ran all the way up until 1984. And they looked basically like this. This is what you'd see in a newspaper at the time, just like you would see, say, Garfield or Foxtrot or any number of other ones these days. Eventually, what happened in these newspaper strips was that they were collected and recolored into a comic book series known as Classic Star Wars. The earliest ones getting their own as Classic Star Wars. The early adventures, there were some oddballs in the middle, but they eventually got recolored, reorganized, and re-released by Dark Horse Comics. What we want to do is take a look at the history of these very briefly, and then take a look at the newspaper strip collection that is our focus this time, the Russ Cochran set. Now, if you're thinking about early 1980s Star Wars comics, usually the ones people think of are from this series. This is the Marvel Comics series, issue number 1 in this case. Those have most recently been collected as the Star Wars Omnibus A Long Time Ago series, volume 1 through volume 5. But that wasn't the only Star Wars comics out there at the time. We're talking about the newspaper strips, a different line, though Archie Goodwin would find himself involved in both of them. Now, when we talk about this term Classic Star Wars, we got to keep in mind there are some other oddball Classic Star Wars issues. There's Classic Star Wars The Vandalhelm Mission, which of course is just a reprint of the Marvel issue Supply and Demand. That's from this same series here. You got Classic Star Wars Devil World, which is essentially Marvel UK material that has not been reprinted elsewhere except for here within the US. They say there's going to be an omnibus with that material in it coming from Dark Horse sometime in the near future. Usually Classic Star Wars is used specifically to refer to, though, those newspaper strips. So in 1979, they bring in a guy named Russ Manning to write the newspaper strips. He starts out with a story called Gambler's World. That's a series that essentially becomes the 9-issue Dark Horse Comics Classic Star Wars The Early Adventures. 9 issues, going all the way to a final issue that freaked a lot of people out with Boba Fett in it. It's eventually collected in the Classic Star Wars The Early Adventures trade paperback. Russ Manning, though, wound up finding himself in bad health in 1980. So he really didn't produce much. Usually it's Archie Goodwin we tend to think of when we think of the newspaper strips. There's Classic Star Wars The Early Adventures, which are most of his stories. He had another story called The Constancia Affair, which wound up not being released in the Early Adventure story, but did eventually get recolored and put together as a special KB Toys Kenner Star Wars special, which is produced by Dark Horse. It is part of the line, it's just kind of hard to find. When he got ill, there's also a comic strip called The Kashyyyk Depths that has never been reprinted anywhere. Not even put up on StarWars.com like the rest of the web strips were that I was able to print out here within the hyperspace area. Kashyyyk Depths has just never been reprinted at all. But as I said, he became ill. Russ Manning was ill, and in 1980, he stepped away from the series, and they brought in Archie Goodwin. But he didn't start writing first as Archie Goodwin. He started writing under the pseudonym Russ Helm. Under Russ Helm, he produced another storyline entitled Planet of Cadril. That was reprinted within those newspaper strip-style web strips, but was not reprinted in the Classic Star Wars comic book series. They waited until they got to the ones he was actually credited with by name. This was 1980, and the first thing that he actually produced that was under his name, Archie Goodwin, was not what we tend to think of as Classic Star Wars, these original stories, but an adaptation. You may be familiar with this book right here, The Han Solo Adventures by Brian Daley, same guy who did the radio dramas for Star Wars. Usually these days if people read it, it's usually read in this omnibus form or something similar. It began as a paperback series, originally released in paperback, not in hardback, oddly enough, through Del Rey. Han Solo that stars in being the first. Well, they took this first Brian Daley Star Wars novel and adapted it into a comic strip that has now been collected, reorganized, re-edited, and colored as Classic Star Wars Han Solo at Star's End. So for those who wondered why just that one and not the other two Han Solo Adventures novels, that's why. It's the only one that Archie Goodwin went through and did as a newspaper strip, so it could be put together in this form right here. That, of course, was also collected later on as the Han Solo at Star's End trade paperback. Just have images of the trade paperbacks here because I tend to collect in single issues most of the time. Now, it's not to be confused, again, as I said, with the Marvel comics, even some of the other Marvel books that collected some of the early stuff. These are not newspaper strips either. The Marvel Illustrated book ones are something a little bit different, which we can deal with at another time. So, what exactly is it that they did when they took these and they created Classic Star Wars from these newspaper strips? Well, here's your original newspaper strips. Take, for instance, this one. The Death Star explodes. We see the Battle of Hoth, briefly, and we see Luke sort of walking through the jungle of Yavin 4. They continue walking. Now, we see these lizard creatures, and then the next day it would pick up with whatever's next. So see Luke's climbing, move on to Luke climbing. Lizard creatures, move on to the lizard creatures. And you continue on day to day to day. Usually only 2 or 3 panels on each given day. Again, all the way from 1979 up through 1984. What they did then was say they took the first storyline, or the first storyline by Archie Goodwin. This is Classic Star Wars #1. Notice they've got the exploding Death Star, and you've got the AT-ATs, right, from the Battle of Hoth, but now they've been given color. You have Luke walking, Luke yelling, as we see in a different panel. Walking, Leia's looking down. You get to the point where you get him kind of off to the side here. Notice that for this one, they added some artwork to make it work. Not only did they colorize it, but see here you don't see Luke's hand. Here you do. It needed to be stretched to make it fit the image, so they had fill-in artwork come in. And there's only one image here of the lizard creatures being ridden by the stormtroopers. It's this image right here, colorized, but with the text underneath, Stormtrooper Patrol, etc., being changed to make it make more sense. This panel is entirely absent because it would have simply been redundant. So they took out a lot of the redundancies, they colorized it, they stretched out some of the storyline, they made it work as something that can read somewhat well straight through as one comic book issue. And in the span of 20 issues of Classic Star Wars, you get essentially all of the Archie Goodwin era run except for Planet of Cadril under the other name, and Han Solo at Star's End, which of course was the novel adaptation rather than original stories. But this Classic Star Wars was not the first time that they did this type of collection. There's 20 issues to that original series. Eventually it winds up being put together into these 3 trade paperbacks. The first one is sometimes called In Deadly Pursuit, sometimes just called Volume 1. The second one, Volume 2, The Revel Storm. And then you have Classic Star Wars Volume 3, Escape to Hoth. Guess what happens by the end of that one? Yeah, they escape to Hoth. But there was another set. Dark Horse Comics got the license for Star Wars comics and started producing them in 1991 with Dark Empire. Marvel had had it before that. There was a weird sort of dark age in between, though, the same era in which the 3 3D Star Wars comics came out from Blackthorn. During that time, you had this monstrous creation. Monstrous in terms of big, but very, very awesome. There's no name on the cover. This is a slipcase that these 3 books are in. On the side, it simply is called Star Wars, written by Archie Goodwin, drawn by Al Williamson. It is a Russ Cochran publication, not Marvel, not Dark Horse. It's sort of a library, in a sense. You have, in this set, 3 different books, which together make up the entirety of the Goodwin run that is in Classic Star Wars. Again, no Han Solo at Star's End, and no Planet of Cadril. This set doesn't do what Classic Star Wars does. It doesn't try to take the pages and essentially adapt the strips into a coherent comic book. This literally is the comic strips. Day after day after day, redundancies included, in their original, non-colorized, no additions, unedited form. So if you're a Star Wars comic strip fan, this is the place to look for them. Better yet, this set, since it's 3 volumes, the first one has some special stuff. An introduction by George Lucas that is not a real signature. You have an introduction by Archie Goodwin, who has recently passed away. Introduction by Al Williamson, who has also passed away. Then Russ Cochran, the publisher, before moving into the actual comic strips. At the end of each of these, you have some oddball ones where you had essentially images that were used as filler for some of the places that had a different format than others and needed an extra panel, and some places, of course, cut them out. However, what makes this a really rare special collector's item is if you look before the introductions, right here. This edition is strictly limited to 2,500 signed and numbered copies, of which this is copy number whatever, in this case, 2095. It is hand-signed by the late Archie Goodwin and the late Al Williamson, 2 true pioneers in Star Wars comic storytelling. This is an amazing tome if you like to read these stories in their comic strip form. It does not read as well as reading in the classic Star Wars comic series or in those trade paperbacks, because let's face it, those are designed to be read all in one sitting. These were little snippets day to day to day to day for about 5 years. So it's going to feel a little disjointed to read this, and I really wish there was such a thing as this done for the Russ Manning era, or for Han Solo at Star's End, or for that short Planet of Cadril thing when he was under the name Russ Helm. But it makes for a really cool collectible item, insanely hard to find because it's not something that Dark Horse can reproduce. It's not their publication. It was only released back in '91. Very limited numbers, 2,500 of these things. Very hard to come by. Now here's the good news and the bad news. The good news is I see these pop up on eBay every once in a while. You know, every few months there tends to be some of these popping up, maybe 1 or 2. There's a couple of them that have been on eBay for a very long time. Here's the reason, though. The reason they've been on there a long time is because the people who put them up at a starting bid or a buy it now price somewhere upwards of $1,500. There's one on there as the time I'm recording this for about $2,500. Kind of ridiculously high prices, although it is an awesome set with those hard to find signatures that now you won't be able to get in person because both men have passed away. I was able to find mine for about $400, I believe it was. You are going to pay a pretty penny to get this set. If you're a Star Wars collector, you like the comic strips, you like the old, early Star Wars stuff that's very hard to come by, and you're all about getting rare signatures, rare autographs on some of these great works, you can't go wrong with this set. It is an awesome piece of Star Wars collecting. Check eBay. Don't try to go more than a few $100 on this thing. That tends to be what it usually sells for. Just because people have it up there for much more doesn't mean that's what it's actually going to wind up selling for. So, if you're interested in classic Star Wars, whether it's this version, or the original strips that eventually wound up in this version, check out the Russ Cochran set. I think you'll find it is a good use of your money if you are a Star Wars collector. Regular EU fans, nah. Stick with the Dark Horse series. It's not exactly a series that has a lot to write home about plot-wise, but it's a cool piece of Star Wars history, given its due finally, right here. For Star Wars Beyond the Films and the EU Cantina's YouTube page, this has been Nathan P. Butler. Thank you for watching.